know that our time, we're kind of backed up a little bit, so I've decided to pare my remarks down a little bit, and I'll tell you how I'm going to do that. But first, a couple of things. Andy Borens told me that Eddie Jacobson not only was a B'nai B'rith member, but was a brother of A.E. Pai at the University of Missouri. So you see, already he was way ahead of his time. So we take great pride in that as well. To comment about Alan Schneider. You know, Alan was a young boy when his family moved to Israel, and I can tell you in the 25 years, a little bit more than that I've known Alan, here is an individual who really lives the Zionist dream, lives it out every day. You could hear it in his presentation. But it's not only that he has a compendium of facts about B'nai B'rith in pre-state Israel, going all the way up to the present day, but he's a trekker. He hikes. He knows almost every stone and every valley and every hill of historical importance in the state of Israel. So we're not only served by someone who is bright and who is well respected in Israel for the work that he does, the political realm and other things that he does, but also by his great grounding in the Zionist ideal. It had been my intention to talk about something called tasks that lie ahead, the 5 great challenges confronting the global Jewish community. If you can look in the last issue, not the current issue, but the last issue of B'nai B'rith magazine, in my column, I go over the 5 points. It had been my intention to talk about those points here this morning, but because of time restrictions, I think I'm going to move to another, perhaps more pressing topic. But let me go through the tasks that lie ahead very quickly. As I say in the article, this is 2013, so a boy, a baby born in 2013, a girl would be 12 years old, so would have been last year. But a bar mitzvah this year, right, 2013, that child at the age of 13, as he or she grows into adulthood, is going to face a world where the Jewish population continues to shrink proportionately with everybody else, and where there's been a rise of Islamic extremism, where there has been an abandonment of Israel by many of its former allies, particularly in Europe. It's going to be a rough situation as that person grows into adulthood in terms of confronting issues affecting the Jewish people globally. So we have to work on building Jewish literacy, find new ways to solidify Jewish identity and a sense of belonging in generations, whether it's teaching about theology or history or knowledge of accomplishments of the Jewish people. Jewish literacy is going to become increasingly important, particularly at a time when there is generally, particularly in this country, more acceptance of Jews, perhaps more than ever before. It doesn't mean that we don't have anti-Semitism, but it means there is greater acceptance. Zionist education, just talked about Alan Schneider. A lot has been written about, well, does this generation, this new generation of Jews, does it have a connection to Israel? Does it feel disaffiliated? I'm not sure whether it's a matter of being disaffiliated or there's a generational issue. Parents today of an 18-year-old, as that 18-year-old goes off to university, parents today of an 18-year-old probably are in their mid-40s. And if they're in their mid-40s, they probably were born just about the time or just after the Six-Day War, which was such a seminal event in terms of Jewish identity. And they would have been youngsters. They would have been 5 or 6 years old at the time of the Yom Kippur War. So we have a generational issue in terms of people remembering the great challenges that the state of Israel felt, the great existential challenges. And so we not only have to inculcate and educate through programs like Birthright and other programs, but we also have to do programs, what we used to call adult education, for those who are approaching middle age, who really have no frame of reference about many of the things that we have been exposed, we who are older have been exposed to over the years in terms of Israel. We have to address the threat of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement, and the movement to demonize and delegitimize Israel. We see it today in academia, we see it in church groups, the entertainment industry. Tom Jones just performed in Israel, you may have read. And I say hats off to Tom Jones, and hats off to Alicia Keys, and hats off to Elton John. There's great pressure on these artists not to perform in Israel because of Israel's quote-unquote human rights abuses and because of the Palestinian issue. And they go and they do it, but a lot of entertainers are dissuaded today. Church groups, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, just a couple of years ago, their boards were discussing resolutions to divest from companies doing business in Israel. The comparison of Israel to South Africa, the comparison of Israel's policies to apartheid, all of that has rolled up into a ball of a tremendous threat to not only the state of Israel, but also to all of us who support Israel. And we have to do, in addition to doing our own education within our own organizations and communities, how to fight these threats, we also have to enlist the support of non-Jewish leaders and their governments and to influence people in the public eye about Israel. BBI plays a central role in doing that. Support for Jewish communities abroad and Holocaust-era restitution. 1989, all of us lived to see the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and in many places where B'nai B'rith had been for many, many years prior to World War II, prior to the rise of the Nazis in 1933, we slowly have come back into places like Slovakia and in Hungary, in Bulgaria, places that B'nai B'rith first was shut down by the Nazis and then was forbidden to reopen by the communists. We've done that over the past 24 years. We are connecting more and more to Jewish communities in Europe. Of course, these are communities that were decimated, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, decimated. We have reached out. B'nai B'rith has an excellent relationship with the governments of many of these countries, but also with the Jewish communities in these countries through the establishment of B'nai B'rith units and lodges in these places. At the same time, we have an obligation to work for Holocaust-era restitution and assets. And B'nai B'rith was a founding member of the World Jewish Restitution Organization. That is the organization that pursues justice to the nth degree for remaining survivors and for their families and for Jewish communities who had their property confiscated. And it could be communal property, meaning community buildings, hospitals, synagogues, and private property restitution as well. You've read in the last couple of weeks about this revelation about this big cache of artworks that were sitting in Germany, 1,500 artworks that have been confiscated by the Nazis. There is a country to country to country, there are still many open books, open chapters in terms of Holocaust-era restitution, and the further away we go from the Holocaust with fewer survivors, as memory really dims, it falls on us to do our level best to achieve some measure of justice. We're never going to get full value. It isn't even a full value issue. It's a matter of justice because the Holocaust was the biggest robbery in history, not only the biggest murder in history. And finally, aging populations. We, as a community, we produce fewer children. We are not really reproducing ourselves, at least in the United States. Were it not for Israel, we are under 2 children per family. But we live longer as a community. And so the proportion of seniors in the Jewish community is probably higher in our community than in any other ethnic group in this country, and I'm sure in other countries as well. And that's why senior services, not just our housing program, but senior services, senior advocacy, working for seniors, dealing with issues affecting Medicare and prescription drugs as we have in the past, transportation issues, security issues, all of those issues affecting seniors need to be addressed. And we are well equipped to do that. And as we continue to age, because it's doubtful that we're going to go back over 2 children per family anytime soon as a community, these issues are going to get more and more pronounced, and B'nai B'rith, I think, is well positioned to deal with those issues. Now, these are all extremely important, but I want to talk this morning now about the biggest challenge facing us today, and that is the Iranian nuclear threat. For 20 years, Tehran has been building a program whose objective is to produce a nuclear weapon. Having a nuclear weapon system not only enables Iran to fire missiles into its enemies, onto its enemies, of which Israel is the primary one, but to build a zone of influence in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East that will allow it to promote its other great objective, which is radical Shiite Islam. Its support for Hezbollah, its considerable influence in Lebanon, and its support for the Syrian regime of Bashar Assad are parts of a game plan for undisputed regional hegemony. No wonder, then, that it's not just Israel, but Iran's neighbors in the region, the Saudis, the Gulf Arabs, and Jordan, who are deeply concerned by the negotiations now underway between the P5+1, those are the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, and Iran that have been taking place in Geneva. Now, there are many moving parts in this story. Iran's acquisition and deployment of advanced centrifuges necessary for creating highly enriched uranium. Its construction now going on of a heavy water reactor at a place called Arak, which will allow it to produce plutonium. Its hidden enrichment facilities, until now mostly forbidden to inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the development of an advanced series of missiles with increasingly extended range are the unmistakable telltale signs of a nuclear weapons program that after 2 decades, we are told by international nuclear and non-proliferation experts, is on the verge, some say as close as 3 months away, of being able to produce a nuclear weapon. Now, over the past several years, in response to the increasingly apparent threat posed by this program, the United States and the West, after much earlier hesitation, have imposed increasingly harsh economic sanctions on Iran. You're going to meet David Cohen tomorrow morning, the Undersecretary of the Treasury, who was instrumental, together with his predecessor, Stuart Levy, in being able to round up other countries to join in these sanctions. Sanctions on banking transfers, on shipping insurance, and on oil exports. Dual-use technology sales have been blocked, and Iranian assets have been frozen, actually in the U.S. since 1979, when Khomeini came to power, primarily in Europe, but elsewhere as well. The Iranian economy has been affected. Unemployment is increasing, and inflation has skyrocketed. Now, with that as the context, the Iranians held a presidential election not too long ago, electing a man who was once its chief nuclear negotiator, and a man who has bragged on the record how he deceived the West during the last round of semi-serious negotiations some 8 years ago. Hassan Rouhani appears frequently to smile, while his predecessor Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was more inclined to smirk. But let there be no mistake that Rouhani has been a key player in Iran's nuclear program, its support of international terror organizations, and its serial abuse of human rights. And so, with international sanctions bearing down on the Iranian economy, the Iranians have once again, and they've done this before, agreed to meet with the P5+1 over its nuclear program. The first session was on November 7th. Meetings were held last week, and another round is scheduled for this week, the 21st and 22nd. The conventional wisdom is that the Iranians are reeling, that they have finally, after 20 years, made a decision to climb down the nuclear ladder and will agree to dismantle their program. Well, don't bet on it. Surely, diplomacy, if deftly carried out, is preferable to war. That said, this current attempt to deal with Iran is envisioned as being a 2-stage process. An initial agreement, which would see the West freeing up frozen assets, including tens of billions of dollars, most of it sitting right now in European banks, in exchange for some Iranian promises, including a 6-month suspension of its enrichment program. That would presumably be followed by a wider, comprehensive agreement that might allow Iran to continue to enrich uranium, but not at a higher, dangerous level. Now, the Iranians say, well, we have the right, don't take the right away from us, we have the right to enrich uranium. Well, the question is whether or not they do have the right, but we know this. There have been a series of UN Security Council resolutions, not just the United States, of UN Security Council resolutions dealing with the Iranian issue. And the Iranians have defied the UN Security Council. So for them to say we want the right suggests not just a matter of national pride, but it suggests that in the back of their minds, if they're able to hold on to the process, they will be able to break out once again and work toward their objective of a nuclear weapon. Now, this week, International Atomic Energy Agency reported that the Iranian program has slowed, that they haven't added many new centrifuges. Well, you have to see that in the context that's being touted by some as an example of how the Iranians are really serious, but you have to see that within the context of 20 years of deception by the Iranians, who have in the past also allowed inspectors in. For example, last week, I'm told that they allowed the inspectors to visit this Iraq facility where the plutonium reactor is. But you know, what they allowed them to do, it's like the equivalent of coming to the Mariaschin Hotel, coming in and saying, "Here, well, here's the lobby." You say, "Well, I want to see the kitchen." "Well, I can't see the kitchen, but here's the lobby, and you're welcome to have a seat." And that's what's been happening. That is classic Iranian deception, and they are quite good at it. But last week, something happened. What had been expected to be an agreement, or the first stage of the negotiations, never happened. Some say that the French balked at agreeing to a plan that gave too much to the Iranians in exchange for too little. Others say the Iranians balked, as they have, when push came to shove, from even agreeing to minimal demands, including opening up the heavy water reactor to full inspection, not to partial inspection, and then to halting work completely on the facility itself. Whatever it was, whatever it happened over that past weekend, it is clear that a bad deal was in the works, and it never happened. Now we'll see what happens this week on the 21st and 22nd. And here's another moving part. Congress, which has led the way in imposing sanctions, has been discussing additional sanctions in the belief that if it is the sanctions that brought Iran to the table in the first place, why not impose additional pressure to make it clear to Tehran that it has no way out? No, the answer to that is, well, you know, if we impose additional sanctions, the Iranians now will walk away. Well, if it has been so punishing until now, why not impose additional sanctions? And the additional sanctions that we're talking about, you know, there are still ways for the Iranians to sell their oil. They're down from 2.5 barrels a day of export to about a million barrels a day, but they're still exporting. And there are still allies of the United States that are importing. We've given them waivers. And what's being suggested here is that these waivers not be granted, that the market be tightened up, and that the Iranians find literally no way out to get out any of that oil. Many members of Congress, and we met just a couple of days ago with the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the ranking member, but we met with other members of Congress as well. Many members of Congress worry that even loosening presumably reversible sanctions, like freeing up financial assets, these billions of dollars in European banks that I talked about, will allow the Iranians to continue to buy time, to kick the can down the road, and one day, North Korea style, announce that it has conducted a successful nuclear test. Good friends in Congress, Democrats and Republicans in large numbers, support such additional pressure on Iran. Now the question is, what will happen in the Senate? We have to see what will happen in the Senate. B'nai B'rith earlier this year, some months ago, supported a House bill on sanctions. There were 400 members, actually. You can imagine. This is we're losing bipartisanship in this country, as you know. If you live here, you know it, and if you're outside the country, you've read about it. And there are very few consensus issues that bring members from both sides of the aisle together, and one of the issues is Iran. Now the test is whether there will be a bill in the Senate on sanctions, or whether there will be a conference and there'll be one bill on additional sanctions or not. The administration, and you'll probably hear this from David Cohen tomorrow, the administration is asking for time, and they say, we need a window to do this, and additional sanctions will chase the Iranians away. Congress has a different view. Many members of Congress have a different view. They feel that at the very least, the administration should take a congressional bill on sanctions and use it as a club, kind of good cop, bad cop. And the president can say, or the administration can say, well, it's Congress. That's the great strength of our democracy here, is that Congress is able to do this. Now, a successful Iranian nuclear weapons program will certainly pose an immense threat to peace and stability in a region that is vitally important to us and to our allies. As Jews, we also know that neither the U.S. nor any European country is a likely early target of an Iranian nuclear weapons program. Only one country will be in the crosshairs of that program, and that's the State of Israel. Although, if Iran is able to achieve the successful conclusion of its nuclear program and creates a weapon, it will have the ability, the technical wherewithal, forgetting about the missiles that they have that could be, God forbid, sent into the heart of Israel. But they will also have the ability to farm out to their allies, allies, they're not really allies, they're part of the Iranian operation, Hezbollah, or other terrorist organizations. You could give them small nuclear weapons. You could give them that suitcase, that briefcase, with some kind of small nuclear device. I mean, there's no end to it. Not to mention, of course, what would happen in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, other countries wanting to have their own nuclear program. A lot here is at stake. But right now, the Iranians have the ability, with their Shahab missile system, to send a rocket 800 miles, 1,000 miles, which could, God forbid, hit Israel. Now, the comparison of Hitler-era rhetoric and today usually draws criticism. Many say that the eras are not comparable, especially because Israel exists today, didn't exist in 1933, and Israel's armed forces are second to none. But references in Iran to Israel as a cancer that needs to be excised, or as vermin, as Iranian leaders have said, and not just Ahmadinejad. A lot of people have kind of said, well, as Ahmadinejad, he's out of the way, that's the end of it. That's not the case. Evoke memories of a darker era, when the very suggestion and threats that Jews were expendable were then carried out to the tragic conclusion that we know all too well. Israel's preoccupation with this threat is seen by some as kind of raining on the welcome Rouhani parade. People, you read it in the New York Times, just yesterday, New York Times editorial, but since Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech before the General Assembly back in September, there's kind of been this impatience with Israel's position, this impatience with the Prime Minister for kind of spoiling everything, raining on the parade here. Everybody's kind of marching toward some kind of an agreement with the Iranians, and why are the Israelis putting their foot out and trying to trip the whole process? I would say this. This is not a comment on a particular Israeli party or on a particular individual. If the Prime Minister of the State of Israel is not going to raise a red flag on this program, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? Especially if Israel is in the crosshairs. So we see what is being said as Israel's clarion call to the international community to stop the Iranian madness now, or to pay a heavy price later on. And there can be only one end result to what is the most serious challenge to our people, to the Western democracies, to the community of democracies in decades. An absolute end to the Iranian drive for a nuclear weapon. Half measures, any half measures, which allow centrifuges to spin, or hidden enrichment facilities to exist, or schools of thought which resign themselves to containment of the Iranian program, cannot be the answer. Now, there were voices in the 1930s that called out, largely on deaf ears, about the impending disaster about to consume Europe and the Jewish people. We must be those voices today. We can speak out loudly, clearly, and to as many diplomats and media people and friends and those who aren't friends, as many as will hear us, that Iran's march to nuclear weapons must be interdicted now before it's too late. B'nai B'rith has taken on this challenge, and with others, hopefully our efforts will succeed.